name's Peter. Peter Jackson. I live close to Manchester in Cheshire. I learnt sign language when I was at school, maybe 6 or 7 years old, and I just picked it up really from the environment whilst playing with other children. In the classroom we had an oral education, yes?
Peter.
Do you have a sign name, Peter? My sign name is this because when I was about 30, in my 30s, 40s and 50s, I used to smoke a pipe. I gave up pipe smoking about 13 years ago, but unfortunately the sign name was stuck. And when I was younger, this was my sign name for tomato, because I had a bright red nose. My school time, I was at 2 different schools. The first school was okay, and the education was awful. But the second school was really hard work. We had a lot of homework. We had to work late. The education was better, but it was still very much an oral system, which I disliked. I was actually born hearing, and I became deaf when I was about 4 or 5. So I was able to read before I became deaf. I became ill with meningitis and actually lost my memory. But after that I was able to pick up reading quite quickly. And I do love to read. I love to write stories. Really like to share experiences with deaf community, mostly linked to work. A long time ago I used to work at the BDA and then retired from that post. I went to work at a college teaching. I was the curriculum manager for sign languages and deaf studies, and retired from that post. That was 12 years ago now. Once I'd finished at school, I became involved in insurance. That was my employment. I became a qualified ACII, Association of Chartered Insurance Institute, and then I gave up that and went to work at Durham University, and then started my post at the British Deaf Association. I was the Director of Health Promotion. I worked at the BDA altogether for 8 years in total. Yeah, in a hearing work environment was quite difficult. Everyone was talking around me, and I never really bothered to interact with other people, with my hearing colleagues. And I was the Deputy Chief Clerk there, so I would just really tell people what to do. They would come to me for advice. But at the BDA, it was great there because I was entrenched in the deaf community, working with the deaf community. And then when I went on to work at college, we had a deaf team of educators there, which was also fantastic. Now, I worked in a hearing environment for 22 years. Access was absolutely minimal as a deaf person. I was good at lip reading, and we relied on writing things down as well. And the first time I employed an interpreter, when I started working for the BDA, I didn't realise what they were or how to use them. That was the first experience I had of working with an interpreter, and that was in 1985. I usually use a pool of about 5 or 6 preferred interpreters. It depends obviously who's available at the time. I don't really use interpreter agencies, only if I'm if I'm in hospital. And they will use specific agencies and will send along an interpreter that I'm used to. Access is quite good, but it's not 100% perfect. I'm thinking about the Climate Control Conference which took place last week. There was no interpreter available there, so access is still quite limited. I think we will never have 100% access. I don't think that's achievable. We can try, but I'm happy with what I do and what I have in terms of access. I am able to communicate effectively with my wife using sign language. I first started attending Deaf Club here in Manchester, and then I married my first wife and we moved to Chester, and I went to the Deaf Club in Chester. But now I don't attend any deaf clubs at all, just anything that's relevant to work really, any events that are relevant to work. I've got plenty of deaf friends. We meet face to face or on Zoom. We meet outside of the deaf clubs. We don't need deaf clubs. I don't need deaf clubs. Now, talking about the Deaf Museum, I think it's really important to preserve information that we have and artifacts for future deaf generations, and also for students who are learning about deaf lives. The Deaf Museum was established in 2006, and it's quite small, and we have grown exponentially since then. One of our members of the BDHS said that in my house I've got lots and lots of things, so we ended up collecting all of these things in my garage actually at home. We sorted through them and we archived some of the items. In terms of funding, it's been very, very difficult. In the first case of applying, nobody had any idea what we were talking about in terms of deaf history, and so I had to spend a lot of time explaining what deaf history was. We have managed to get several funding grants, and now I have somebody who does the grant applications for me, but I think if they leave, I'm going to have to carry on doing them themselves. When I come to retire, I have no idea what's going to happen. We have had some lottery funding for the museum. It has been very, very difficult because we have to make sure that we follow the criteria, we meet the criteria, which requires a good standard of English to complete the application forms. And also when you're talking and meeting people in terms of heritage lottery funding, we have several meetings with them to progress the application, and so we need interpreters for those meetings. We have a member of staff part-time on a short-term contract. Once the contract is finished, then we will no longer be in employment. I think we need more volunteers and maybe set up a different project so that we could attract different members of staff. I agree that we were very lucky, we have been very lucky, because my fundraising officer has really good relationships with HLF. She used to work for HLF previously. And so on the back of that relationship, we were able to move the museum. Without her help in finding that funding, I'm sure the museum would have had to close permanently. It was first set up in Warrington, the museum, at the Deaf Club, and then moved to a different location in Warrington, and now this is our final move to Manchester. I'm planning for my retirement soon, so I'm hoping that there's somebody else that will take the lead in terms of looking after the museum and moving it forward for future generations. I think I have done my bit and I have come to the end of my tenure. We do need more digital presence, a bigger digital presence, definitely. This was from my old school, this board. This was the honours board. I'm not on it because I was never a good boy. I was always too naughty to be on the honours list. My school closed down and lots of the things from that school we were able to save and bring to the museum. That's great.